At 0545 on May 5th, 1945, Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss crawled to the edge of a 400-foot cliff on Okinawa, listening to the screams of wounded Marines echoing from the plateau above. 26 years old. Combat medic. The only soldier in his company who refused to carry a weapon. The Japanese had turned the escarpment called Hacksaw Ridge into a killing ground. The 96th Infantry Division had spent the previous day trying to scale the cliff. They had succeeded. 155 soldiers had climbed cargo nets to the top, established a perimeter, and prepared to advance across the plateau toward the Japanese defensive positions. Then the Japanese counterattacked. At 0530, thousands of enemy soldiers emerged from tunnels and caves that honeycombed the ridge. They hit the American perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously: machine gun fire, mortars, grenades, hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and swords. Within 15 minutes, the American position collapsed. Soldiers fell back toward the cliff edge. Some jumped, some were pushed, some died before they could move. The cargo nets that had carried them up now carried survivors down, those who could reach them. But dozens of wounded men remained on the plateau, too injured to walk, too injured to crawl, lying in shell craters and behind rocks, while Japanese soldiers methodically executed every American they found. Desmond Doss had reached the top of the cliff with his company. He had watched the position collapse. He had seen men die around him. He had followed the retreat to the cliff edge. Then he stopped. He turned around and walked back toward the Japanese. He carried no rifle, no pistol, no bayonet, no grenades. His only equipment was a medical kit, bandages, morphine syringes, plasma bottles, and a rope he had fashioned into a makeshift rescue harness. The Japanese controlled the plateau. Hundreds of enemy soldiers were moving through the American positions, killing wounded, stripping bodies, setting up defensive positions for the counterattack they knew would come. And one American medic was walking directly into them, unarmed, to save men who could not save themselves. If you want to see how Desmond Doss became the only conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about forgotten heroes. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Doss. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia. His father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter who had served in the Army during World War I. His mother, Bertha Oliver Doss, was a devout Seventh-day Adventist who raised her children according to the strict principles of their faith. The Seventh-day Adventist Church observed Saturday as the Sabbath. They believed in vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol and tobacco, and the literal interpretation of the 10 Commandments. The 6th commandment was particularly important: "Thou shalt not kill." Desmond absorbed these teachings from infancy. The family home contained a framed poster showing the 10 Commandments, each one illustrated with a small picture. The image for the 6th commandment showed Cain standing over Abel's body, the first murder in human history. Desmond stared at that image throughout his childhood. He made a promise to himself and to God. He would never kill another human being, no matter what, no matter the circumstances. He would never take a life. The promise seemed easy in Lynchburg, Virginia, in the 1920s. America was at peace. The Great War had ended. No one expected another conflict. A boy could promise never to kill, and never face a test of that promise. But promises made in childhood have a way of being tested in adulthood. Desmond Doss would face that test in ways he could never have imagined. The Doss family struggled during the Depression. William's carpentry work dried up. Bertha took in laundry. The children worked odd jobs when they could find them. Desmond dropped out of school after 8th grade to help support the family. He found work at a lumber yard, then at a shipyard in Newport News. The shipyard built warships for the Navy. Desmond worked as a joiner, fitting wooden components into steel hulls. The work was hard, but steady. He earned enough to help his family and save a little for himself. He also met a woman. Dorothy Shuda was a Seventh-day Adventist like Desmond. She taught at the church school. She was beautiful, intelligent, and shared his faith. They began courting in 1941, attending church services together, walking in the Virginia countryside, talking about their future. Desmond wanted to marry Dorothy. He wanted to build a life with her. He wanted children, a home, a peaceful existence, far from violence and conflict. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941 changed everything for every American. The country was at war. Young men across the nation rushed to enlist. Recruiting stations overflowed with volunteers, eager to fight the enemy that had killed 2,400 Americans in a single morning. Desmond did not rush to enlist. His religious beliefs prohibited killing. His promise to God remained unbroken, but he also felt a duty to his country. America was under attack. Young men were dying. How could he stay home while others fought? He struggled with the question for months. He prayed. He consulted with his pastor. He talked with Dorothy about what he should do. The Selective Service Act had been passed in 1940. Every American male between 21 and 45 was required to register for the draft. Desmond had registered. His number would eventually be called. He would have to serve whether he wanted to or not. But the Selective Service recognized conscientious objectors. Men who opposed all war on religious grounds could apply for non-combatant status. They would serve in the military, but would not be required to carry weapons or participate in combat. Desmond applied for non-combatant status. His request was approved. He would serve as a medical corpsman, a soldier trained to save lives rather than take them. On April 1st, 1942, Desmond Doss reported for basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He was 23 years old, 5'8", 165 pounds. He had never held a rifle in his life. He was about to enter a world that despised everything he believed in. Basic training was designed to transform civilians into killers. The Army's methods were brutal, systematic, and effective. Drill sergeants screamed profanity at recruits. Physical training pushed men to their limits. Rifle drill consumed hours each day. And Desmond Doss refused to touch a rifle. His commanding officers could not understand him. The other recruits could not understand him. A soldier who would not carry a weapon? What use was he? How could they trust him in combat? How could they depend on a man who would not fight? The harassment began immediately. Soldiers threw boots at Doss while he slept. They tripped him during marches. They called him a coward, a weakling, a yellow-bellied Bible thumper who was too scared to fight. They threatened to kill him themselves and save the Japanese the trouble. One soldier told Doss that he would personally shoot him in combat. "You'll never make it out of this war alive," the man said. "If the Japs don't get you, I will." Doss's platoon sergeant tried to have him discharged for mental instability, a soldier who refused to carry a weapon. But the harassment did not stop. If anything, it intensified. The other soldiers resented that they could not get rid of him. They made his life as miserable as possible, hoping he would quit, hoping he would request a transfer, hoping he would give up and go home. Doss did not quit. He did not request a transfer. He did not go home. Every night, he knelt beside his bunk and prayed. The other soldiers watched him, mocked him, threw things at him. He continued praying. When they finished, he climbed into his bunk and went to sleep. The next morning, he woke up and faced another day of abuse. He was fighting a battle that none of his tormentors understood. They thought he was weak because he would not fight them. They did not realize that his faith required more strength than their fists ever could. Rifle training presented a particular problem. Every soldier was required to qualify with the M1 Garand rifle. The Army would not deploy men who could not shoot. Doss could not shoot because he would not touch a rifle. His commanding officer called him into the company headquarters. Captain Jack Glover was a career soldier, a man who had devoted his life to the Army. He did not understand conscientious objectors. He did not like them. but he was also a professional who followed regulations. Doss, Glover said, the Army requires every soldier to qualify with a rifle. If you don't qualify, you can't deploy. If you can't deploy, you're useless to me. Do you understand? Doss understood. He had thought about this problem for months. He had a solution. Sir, I'm willing to qualify with the rifle, Doss said. I just won't carry one in combat. Glover stared at him. The answer was unexpected. A conscientious objector willing to learn to shoot? You'll touch the rifle during training? Yes, sir. I'll complete the qualification course, but I won't carry a weapon when we ship out. Glover considered the offer. It was technically acceptable. The regulations required qualification, not combat use. If Doss qualified during training and then served as a medic without a weapon, the paperwork would be satisfied. All right, Doss. Get out there and qualify. Desmond Doss went to the rifle range. He picked up an M1 Garand for the first time in his life. He learned to load it, aim it, fire it. He shot at paper targets, not human beings. He told himself that learning to shoot was not the same as killing. He qualified as a marksman, not the highest rating, but good enough. The Army would deploy him. Then he put down the rifle and never picked it up again. In early 1944, the 77th Infantry Division shipped out for the Pacific. Doss had been assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. He was the company's senior medic, responsible for providing first aid to wounded soldiers and evacuating casualties to aid stations. The division's first combat action came on Guam in July 1944. The Japanese had held the island since 1941. The Marines had landed first, establishing beachheads. The 77th came ashore to support the advance inland. Doss experienced combat for the first time. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles cracking, machine guns hammering, artillery shells screaming overhead. Men fell around him, some dead instantly, others screaming in agony, others silent and still. He moved among the wounded, bandaging, injecting morphine, applying tourniquets. He dragged injured soldiers to cover. He stayed with dying men until they passed. He prayed over bodies that no longer breathed. The soldiers who had tormented him during training watched him work. They saw him crawling through fire to reach wounded men. They saw him ignoring bullets that cracked past his head. They saw him hopeless. They looked for the medic who was always there, always willing to risk his life for theirs. Captain Glover, who had once tried to discharge Doss, now praised him in official reports. Private Doss has consistently distinguished himself by exceptional courage and devotion to duty. Glover wrote, "His presence in this company is an invaluable asset." The transformation was complete. The coward had become indispensable. The man who would not fight had become the one everyone wanted beside them when the fighting started. Okinawa was different from anything that came before. The island was 60 miles long and 18 miles wide at its widest point. The Japanese had fortified it with 100,000 soldiers, hundreds of artillery pieces, and the most elaborate defensive system of the Pacific War. They had spent years building bunkers, tunnels, and underground fortresses that could withstand any bombardment. The American invasion began on April 1st, 1945. The initial landings were almost unopposed. The Japanese had withdrawn from the beaches, concentrating their forces in the southern hills where the terrain favored defense. The 77th Division came ashore on April 17th. They were assigned to the southern sector, where the Japanese defenses were strongest. Their first objective was the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff that the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. The cliff rose almost vertically from the coastal plain. At the top, a plateau stretched several hundred yards to the next ridge. The Japanese had fortified the plateau with pillboxes, bunkers, and interconnected tunnels. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. The only way to reach the plateau was to climb the cliff. Cargo nets had been hung from the top, allowing soldiers to pull themselves up hand over hand. Once on top, they would face whatever the Japanese had waiting for them. On May 1st, Company B began its assault on Hacksaw Ridge. The climb itself was exhausting. Soldiers carried 60 pounds of equipment. The nets swayed with every movement. At the top, Japanese fire immediately pinned them down. The fighting was brutal. The Japanese defenders were dug in so deep that artillery had almost no effect. Every bunker had to be reduced individually with grenades, demolition charges, and flamethrowers. Every yard of ground cost blood. Doss worked without rest. He treated wounds. He dragged casualties to the cliff edge where they could be lowered to safety. He crawled through fire that no rational person would enter. On May 2nd, a grenade exploded near a group of soldiers. 3 men went down. Doss ran to them, treated their wounds, and carried each one to safety, while Japanese machine guns tried to cut him down. On May 3rd, a mortar round landed in a foxhole. 2 soldiers were killed instantly. A third was badly wounded, his legs shattered. Doss reached him, applied tourniquets, administered morphine, and stayed with him until stretcher-bearers could evacuate him. On May 4th, the company pushed deeper into the plateau. The fighting intensified. Casualties mounted. Doss treated so many wounded that he lost count. His medical supplies ran low. He began improvising bandages from clothing stripped from the dead. Then came May 5th. The Japanese counterattack began before dawn. Thousands of enemy soldiers had infiltrated American positions during the night. They emerged from tunnels and spider holes across the entire line. The attack hit simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming defenders who were still exhausted from 4 days of continuous combat. Company B's position collapsed in minutes. The company commander was killed. The platoon sergeants were killed or wounded. Communication with battalion headquarters was severed. The first wounded soldier he found was Lieutenant Cecil Garanto. Garanto had been shot through both legs. He could not walk. He could not crawl. He was lying in a shell crater, waiting to die. Doss reached him, dragged him to cover, checked his wounds. The lieutenant needed evacuation immediately. He would bleed out within the hour without proper treatment. Doss fashioned a rope into a makeshift stretcher. He tied it around Garanto's chest, looped it over a tree stump, and began lowering the lieutenant over the cliff edge. The rope was not designed for this. The friction burned Doss's hands. The weight of a full-grown man pulled against him. But he held on, lowered Garanto foot by foot, until the soldiers below could reach him. 1 man saved. Doss pulled the rope back up and went looking for another. The sun rose on a nightmare landscape. The plateau was covered with bodies, American and Japanese. Smoke rose from burning vehicles. Artillery craters pocked the ground. The Japanese were everywhere, moving in groups, searching for survivors, killing anyone they found. Doss moved through this hell like a ghost. He stayed low, used cover, avoided detection. When he found a wounded American, he treated the most critical injuries, then dragged the man to the cliff edge and lowered him to safety. 1 man at a time. The first hour, he rescued 5 soldiers. Some were conscious, able to help themselves onto the rope. Others were unconscious, requiring Doss to tie them securely and pray the knots held during the descent. The second hour, he rescued 7 more. His hands were raw from the rope burns. His arms ached from the constant lifting and lowering. But he kept moving, kept searching, kept finding men who needed him. The Japanese were close now. He could hear their voices, hear their boots crunching on the volcanic rock. Several times, they passed within yards of his position. He lay perfectly still, not breathing, praying they would not see him. They never saw him. Later, men would call it a miracle. Doss moved across a plateau occupied by hundreds of enemy soldiers, and none of them found him. He was invisible, protected by something that rational explanation could not account for. He believed God was shielding him. He believed his mission was holy, his work righteous. He believed that as long as he was saving lives, God would not let him die. The third hour, he rescued 8 more soldiers. The pile of wounded men at the base of the cliff was growing. Medics and stretcher-bearers worked frantically to treat them and evacuate them to aid stations. Above them, Doss kept working. He found a soldier named Herb Schechter lying in a crater, shot through the shoulder. Schechter was conscious, but weak from blood loss. Doss bandaged the wound, helped Schechter to the cliff edge, and lowered him down. He found a soldier named Carl Bentley with shrapnel wounds across his chest and abdomen. Bentley was unconscious, barely breathing. Doss treated the wounds as best he could, tied the rope around Bentley's chest, and lowered him over the edge. He found a soldier named Clarence Glenn with both legs broken. Glenn could not help himself at all. Doss carried him 50 yards to the cliff, secured him in the rope harness, and lowered him down. One at a time, hour after hour, soldier after soldier. By noon, Doss had been working for 6 hours. He had rescued more than 30 men. His hands were bleeding, his arms could barely function, his body screamed for rest. But there were more wounded on the plateau. He could hear them calling for help, their voices weak, their hope fading. He went back. The afternoon brought new challenges. The Japanese Doss could not perform surgery, but he could keep Kirby alive long enough to reach a surgeon. He sealed the chest wound with a bandage, elevated Kirby's legs to prevent shock, and lowered him over the cliff. He found a soldier named Roy Doss, no relation with shrapnel in his legs. Roy was conscious and angry, cursing the Japanese, cursing the war, cursing his own bad luck. Desmond treated his wounds and lowered him to safety. He found a soldier whose name he never learned, a young man, barely 18, with half his face blown away by a grenade. The soldier was somehow still alive, still breathing, still conscious behind the ruin of his features. Doss treated what he could. He gave the soldier morphine for the pain. He spoke to him softly, told him help was coming, told him to hold on. Then he lowered him over the cliff and prayed the surgeons could save him. One at a time. The sun began to set. Doss had been on the plateau for nearly 12 hours. He had lost count of how many men he had rescued. 40? 50? More? His body had stopped sending pain signals. The nerves had simply shut down, overwhelmed by the constant strain. He moved like a machine, following a routine he had repeated so many times it no longer required conscious thought. Find a wounded man, treat his injuries, drag him to the cliff, lower him down, go find another. The Japanese had largely withdrawn from the forward areas by now. American artillery had begun falling on the plateau, forcing the enemy back. But isolated groups of Japanese soldiers remained, and they were actively hunting the mysterious medic who was emptying their prisoner pool one man at a time. Doss heard Japanese voices close by. He dropped to the ground and pressed himself into a shell crater. 3 enemy soldiers walked past, rifles ready, scanning the terrain. One of them stopped. He looked directly at the crater where Doss was hiding. He stared for a long moment. Then he walked on. Later, Doss would say that God had blinded the soldier's eyes. There was no other explanation. The Japanese had looked directly at him and seen nothing. It was impossible, but it had happened. He waited until the soldiers were gone, then resumed his search. By nightfall, Doss had rescued approximately 75 men. The exact number was never verified. Doss himself claimed he had saved maybe 50. He did not keep count. He did not think about numbers. He simply worked until there was no one left to save. Other soldiers who witnessed his actions estimated the number at 75 or higher. Some claimed he had rescued over 100 men. The army eventually settled on 75 as the official count, though the true number may never be known. What was certain was this: Desmond Doss had spent 12 hours alone on a Japanese-held plateau, unarmed, crawling among enemy soldiers, rescuing wounded Americans one at a time. He had not fired a shot. He had not thrown a grenade. He had not killed a single Japanese soldier. He had simply refused to let his comrades die. When he finally climbed down the cargo net, his hands were so damaged that he could barely grip the ropes. Other soldiers had to help him down the final 100 feet. He collapsed at the base of the cliff and lay there, unable to move. A medic treated his hands. The rope burns had gone through the skin in several places, exposing raw tissue beneath. His fingers were swollen and bloody. He would need weeks to heal. But he had saved 75 men. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge was not over. The Americans would assault the plateau again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The fighting would continue for weeks until the Japanese defensive line finally collapsed. Doss returned to combat 3 days later, his hands still bandaged, his body still exhausted. Company B needed him. The wounded needed him. He could not stay behind. On May 21st, 1945, Doss was treating wounded soldiers. He was bleeding badly. Other medics rushed to help him, but Doss waved them off. There were more seriously wounded men nearby. They needed treatment first. He waited for 5 hours while other soldiers were treated. When stretcher bearers finally came for him, he noticed a more badly wounded man nearby. He rolled off the stretcher and told the bearers to take the other soldier instead. While waiting for another stretcher, Doss was hit again. A sniper's bullet shattered his left arm. The force of the impact knocked him backward. He lay in the dirt, bleeding from his legs and his arm, watching American soldiers and Japanese soldiers die around him. He used a rifle stock as a splint for his broken arm. He did not use the rifle itself. Even wounded, even dying, he would not pick up a weapon. When stretcher bearers finally evacuated him, they found his Bible clutched in his right hand. He had been praying the entire time. Desmond Doss spent months recovering from his wounds. The shrapnel had damaged his legs severely. The bullet had shattered bones in his arm. Doctors eventually removed part of his lung, which had been damaged by tuberculosis contracted during his service. He would never fully recover. The injuries left him partially disabled for the rest of his life. He could not do heavy labor. He could not work the farms of his Virginia childhood. The war had taken his health, even though it had not taken his principles. On October 12th, 1945, President Harry Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. Doss stood at attention while the president read the citation. Private, First Class, Desmond T. Doss distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in the vicinity of Urasoe Mura and the Maeda Escarpment, Okinawa, during the period from April 29 to the 21st of May, 1945. The citation described his actions in detail. The 12 hours on the plateau, the 75 men rescued, the wounds he suffered, the courage he displayed. Truman placed the medal around Doss's neck and shook his hand. "I'm proud of you," the president said. "You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. He would remain the only one until the Vietnam War, when another conscientious objector named Thomas Bennett received the award posthumously. Desmond Doss returned to Lynchburg, Virginia, and married Dorothy Schutte. They had one son, Desmond Thomas Doss, Jr., born in 1946. The injuries Doss had suffered made it impossible for him to work as a carpenter like his father. He and Dorothy lived on a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia, where they raised their son and lived quietly. Doss did not talk about the war. He did not seek publicity. He did not write memoirs or give speeches. When people asked about his Medal of Honor, he deflected the attention. "I just couldn't give up on those men," he said. "They were my brothers. I had to help them." He spent much of his post-war life helping other veterans. He counseled soldiers dealing with what would later be called PTSD. He visited hospitals where wounded men were recovering. He told them that faith and determination could overcome any obstacle. Dorothy died in a car accident in 1991. Doss was devastated. They had been married for 46 years. He never fully recovered from her loss. He remarried in 1993 to Frances Duman, another Seventh-day Adventist who shared his faith. They lived together in Alabama until his death. On March 23, 2006, Desmond Thomas Doss died at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He was buried with full military honors at the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His Medal of Honor was displayed at his funeral. Hundreds of people attended, including many who had never met him, but had been inspired by his story. The Seventh-day Adventist Church honored him. Gibson had worked on the film for over a decade. He had met with Doss before his death, recorded interviews, gathered details about his experiences. Gibson wanted the film to be accurate, to honor the man whose story he was telling. He was the real deal, Gibson said. Everything in that movie, all the stuff that seems impossible had happened. We actually toned some of it down because audiences wouldn't believe the truth. The scenes of Doss lowering wounded men over the cliff, one at a time, hour after hour, those were accurate. The scenes of Japanese soldiers walking past his hiding place without seeing him, those were accurate. The scenes of him refusing to pick up a rifle even when his life depended on it, those were accurate. The only fictional element was the romance subplot, which Gibson admitted had been simplified for dramatic purposes. Everything else came from Doss's own testimony, from interviews with survivors, from military records that documented his actions. The legacy of Desmond Doss extends beyond his Medal of Honor. He proved that courage does not require violence. He proved that a man could serve his country without compromising his principles. He proved that faith, genuine faith, could sustain a person through horrors that broke stronger men. The soldiers who had tormented him during training eventually understood what he was. He was not a coward who hid behind religion. He was the bravest man they had ever known, facing death unarmed because he believed that killing was wrong. That belief never wavered. From his childhood in Lynchburg to his death in Alabama, Desmond Doss remained true to his promise. He never took a life. He only saved them. 75 men went home to their families because of him. 75 men lived to see their children born, to grow old, to die in peace rather than on a Japanese-held plateau. 75 families were not destroyed. 75 wives did not become widows. 75 children did not grow up fatherless. One man, without a weapon, changed 75 destinies. The Maeda Escarpment still stands on Okinawa. The cliffs where Doss performed his rescue are now a memorial site. Tourists visit to see where the battle was fought, to imagine what it must have been like to climb those cargo nets under fire. The Japanese have built monuments to their own dead. The Americans have built monuments to theirs. But the most significant monument is invisible. The descendants of the 75 men Doss saved. People who exist only because one medic refused to abandon their fathers and grandfathers. Some of those descendants have visited Okinawa. They have stood at the base of Hacksaw Ridge and looked up at the cliff. They have tried to imagine what their ancestors experienced, what Doss experienced, what it meant to be lowered down that rope to safety. One descendant, the grandson of a soldier Doss rescued, made the pilgrimage in 2015. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about medics who saved 75 men without carrying a weapon. Stories about faith that survived the worst that war could offer. Real people. Real heroism. Real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, where the battle took place and the peace was finally won. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you have ever heard of Desmond Doss before today. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure that Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss never becomes just another forgotten name from a war that claimed millions. He saved 75 men. He never fired a shot. He proved that courage has many forms. Desmond Doss, the man who would not kill, the man who saved lives instead. Gone but never forgotten.